All right, diving in today, folks. We're taking a look at Bob Camblin.
Really interesting artist.
Yeah, definitely one of a kind. And I think what makes this deep dive even more fascinating is the material we've got. It's not just, one biography or a collection of paintings. We've got writings from Camblin himself. We've got those biographical accounts, of course.
Right.
We even found this YouTube discussion analyzing his painting, Mother and Child, which I think we'll definitely circle back to later because it was so insightful. So, I mean, we're really trying to get, like, the full picture of his art, and his philosophy.
Yeah, the philosophy is essential. You can't really separate it from the work itself. And that's one of the things that makes Camblin so intriguing, right? He's this widely recognized figure in the art world, but he still feels kind of enigmatic, elusive.
Totally. And the more you learn about him, the more you realize there's always more to uncover. His work, I mean, it's highly sought after.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's not just about the aesthetics. People talk about his work having these, like, hidden meanings, secrets, that draw you in.
It's true. There's a real depth there that keeps you coming back. You see something new every time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics, right? I mean, Bob Camblin, he was born in Oklahoma
1928.
in 1928,
Hmm.
and his artistic journey, at least formally, begins at the Kansas City Art Institute. Pretty standard, right?
Sure, a classic art school beginning.
But then things take a turn, and I think this is where it starts to get really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. The Fulbright scholarship, that's what really changed things. It took him to Italy, and you can just see how that experience completely transformed his vision. Exposure to the European masters, the Impressionists. Think about the Uffizi Gallery, all those masterpieces.
I mean, that's a lot to take in.
And he didn't just stick to the well-known either. He visited the Capuchin catacombs in Palermo. Remember those skeletal remains, those mummies?
Yeah, it's mentioned how those images stayed with him, like these abstract, haunting figures. They became a recurring motif, almost like like an underlying current in his work.
Yeah.
And it's such a stark contrast, right, from the beauty of Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Primavera to, those stark images of death.
And speaking of Botticelli, there's this really interesting tidbit in one of the sources about Camblin's take on the Birth of Venus. Apparently, he saw it as a kind of like a tribute to KPFT radio in Houston. It's this wild connection, Renaissance art, and a modern listener-supported radio station. What do you make of that?
Well, it points to something really fundamental in Camblin's approach. It's this constant drive to connect different eras, different contexts, different ideas. I mean, look at his painting of Flora, inspired by Botticelli's Primavera. But then he weaves in these modern elements, hearts, electrons, even a haiga, that combination of haiku and painting.
It's almost like he's creating this secret language.
Yeah, a visual language with layers upon layers of meanings. Like he's saying that the core human experiences, the things that artists grapple with, they transcend time. They echo across the centuries.
Exactly.
So after all this incredible European experience, he comes back to the States. He starts teaching. Rice University. But it's interesting, his upbringing in Ponca City, Oklahoma, it seems to have had a lasting impact, too.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about the Marland Estate, the Pioneer Woman statue. How do you think those, like, Oklahoma landmarks might have shaped him as an artist?
I think they're essential. I mean, the biography talks about how those landmarks, especially the Pioneer Woman, potentially influenced his art. And there's this amazing little detail. He used double V's in some paintings as a personal shorthand for his mother, Viva Camblin.
Wow.
So you have this iconic public monument and then this really personal, almost private symbol. It makes you think about how our early environments, those places we grew up in, they stay with us, they shape us in ways we might not even realize.
They become part of our, like, creative DNA almost.
It's true.
And it's not just the visual, right?
Yeah.
We know he loved The Wizard of Oz. That seems to have made a big impression on him.
It did.
And he was a huge reader. Emerson, I Ching, all those haiku and haiga.
Voracious reader, really. And I think that's important to consider when you look at his later work in his philosophy. The concision of haiku, the depth of Emerson, the I Ching, the philosophical ideas there. It all feeds into his interest in layering meaning, creating work that's not just surface level,
Okay.
Work that makes you think, makes you really look closely.
It demands something from the viewer.
Exactly.
And it seems like he wasn't always working alone, even early on. He and Forrest Harrisberger, they were in the military together in California, and they'd sketch the coastline.
Yeah, a real bond there, not just artistic, but personal too.
Hmm.
And it foreshadows his later collaborations, which we'll get into. But it's important to see how all these experiences, the European travels, growing up in Oklahoma, the literature, the film, and these early partnerships, they all start to form this unique artistic identity.
Like a foundation for everything that comes later.
Right, it's all connected.
So we've got this foundation. How does his distinct artistic philosophy start to emerge? Because we know he went from map making to teaching, and then at some point he starts to feel disillusioned with what he calls the staid and orthodox.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, and I think his move to Houston was crucial.
It seemed to energize him.
It did. Houston had these more contemporary galleries. Collectors were more open to his work, more
They
enthusiastic.
embraced it.
They did, and that fueled him, you know. It solidified his belief that the traditional art world, the structures, the institutions, they weren't always serving the artists, the work itself.
And he was pretty vocal about that, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, he had some strong criticisms of galleries and museums.
He did. He felt they often missed the point. They didn't truly understand what the artists were trying to do, and they didn't create the right environment for the work to be experienced. He thought artists should have more control, minimize distractions. He even suggested artists overlap their shows, work in the gallery space while people are there. Really radical ideas.
Break down those barriers.
Exactly. It was about transparency, about letting people into the creative process.
And it's interesting because alongside all this critique, he also had this strong belief in faith and good work.
Mhm.
There's a lot of talk about that kind of idealism. And he sometimes even refused to be paid for his art.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? He saw value in hard work, in integrity, in the artistic process itself. The refusal of payment, it's almost like a rejection of the commercialization of art. Like, this is about something more.
It has intrinsic value.
Right.
And then there's this image that comes up a lot, both in his writings and when people talk about him. It's this idea of turning stumbling blocks into stepping stones, which often appears in his paintings as jars of water. Why jars of water? What's that all about?
It's a beautiful metaphor, isn't it? It's about resilience, about reframing challenges as opportunities. The water, it represents clarity. You let things settle. You see through the turbulence. You find a way forward.
It's a very Zen concept.
Very much so. Finding that inner peace, that stillness amidst chaos.
Now, another recurring motif is the scarecrow. That whole series was initially inspired by Günter Grass.
The German novelist and playwright.
Mm-hmm. But Camblin's scarecrows, they go beyond those simple, agrarian figures. They become these explorations of myths, metamorphosis, and he even incorporates things like lobster shells, larva shells, these unexpected elements. How did the scarecrow become this vehicle for exploring these big themes?
It's about layering. You start with this image of the scarecrow, this almost folkloric figure associated with spring, with renewal, but then he adds these elements from nature, these discarded shells representing these cycles of life and death, transformation. It's about looking beyond the surface, seeing the deeper connections, the interconnectedness of everything.
It forces you to ask questions.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
And then there's the text, right? The words he incorporates into his drawings. It's described as both a disguise and a clue, referencing Tom Wolfe's The Painted Word, and this idea that seeing should be believed. And he even included, codes, visual traps to engage the viewer.
Yeah.
Why this interplay between the visual and the textual.
It's almost like he's creating a puzzle. The text isn't just there to explain the image. It's part of the artwork, adding another layer, maybe even obscuring things, making you work harder to understand it. And those traps, they're intentional. He wants you to stumble, to question, to really look closely and think critically.
So it's not passive viewing.
Not at all. He wants you to be an active participant.
And we know he was really ambitious. He wanted to, quote, remake Goya in 20th century terms.
Huge ambition, right, aligning himself with those artistic giants who really shook things up. And he wanted to push further than surrealism, too, not just dreamlike imagery, but these unexpected juxtapositions, these things that jar you, make you question what you're seeing, question your own assumptions about reality.
So his early work, his social protest pieces, those were more straightforward, heavy outlines, flat colors. But then his style shifts, becomes this mix of social realism and non-objective art. He was influenced by Cremoni
The Italian painter.
and ancient Etruscan figurines. How did all those influences come together?
It's fascinating. It shows how he constantly experimented, drawing from such different sources. Cremoni's work, it often unsettling, dreamlike, but still figurative. And those Etruscan figurines are so simplified, so ancient. I think Camblin was looking for that same kind of timelessness, that connection to something primal, something that speaks to the human condition on a really deep level.
And he wanted his drawings to stand on their own. He started creating these huge drawings that he felt could, quote, compete favorably with paintings. He even included visible corrections. You can see the process, like in The Descent from the Cross.
That's a statement, right? Those drawings, they're not just sketches, they're works of art in themselves. And those corrections, they're intentional, they're part of the piece. It's him saying, this is how I work, this is the process. It's not about perfection, it's about the journey.
Then in the 1960s, he's really focused on blending the styles of Hugo van der Goes.
The early Netherlandish painter.
Yeah, and Goya, which is an interesting combination.
Very much so. You have the subtle poetry of Van der Goes and the raw emotion of Goya. And he experimented with aging the paper he used, layering it, creating these subtle gradations of tone. It's another way of incorporating time, the element of chance, into the work itself.
And then there's a series of masks, which is pretty enigmatic.
Very much so. It suggests this exploration of identity, the different faces we wear, the masks we put on. It's a theme that runs through a lot of his work.
The 1970s is when he really starts to dig into the concept of metamorphosis. And he does it from this, like, evolutionary perspective. Lots of recurring imagery. Puppets, the scarecrows again, skulls, reliquaries. It's all about exploring those big questions of life and death and transformation.
Right, and he's drawing from so many different sources. Freud, De Chirico, Grunewald, Kazantzakis, and Grass again. That's a pretty diverse group.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to bring all these different ideas together. And there's this quote from him about how art is both serious and humorous. That really captures his approach, doesn't it?
I think it does. It's about recognizing the absurdity of life, the darkness, but also finding the humor, the light in it all.
So in the 1980s, his work evolves again. He starts combining drawings and watercolors, creating these almost illusionistic surfaces that hint at hidden meanings.
And those hidden meanings, he believed you could only find them through what he called sensitive draftsmanship. You have to really look closely, look past the obvious.
He was setting traps again.
Exactly. He was rewarding those who take the time to engage with the work on a deeper level. And that idea that the art itself could change over time, that secret images could emerge, it's really intriguing. It's like the artwork is alive, it's breathing, it's still evolving.
Okay, so we have to talk about Mouche Volantes.
Right.
That style he developed in the 1970s. For those who aren't familiar, can you explain what that is, what it looks like?
Sure. Mouche volantes is French for flying flies, and it refers to those little specks you sometimes see floating in your field of vision. You know, those little almost translucent things that drift across when you look at something bright.
Yeah.
It's a very apt name for his style, too, because it's all about creating those kinds of fleeting, almost hallucinatory images. It's very much in line with Dada and surrealism, that interest in the irrational, the subconscious, the disruption of how we typically see things.
And Camblin was all about collaboration. He worked with Earl Staley and Joe Tate.
Yeah, they formed B&E Productions, the holding firm, and they put on these collaborative events, which were really more like happenings. They wanted to break down those traditional barriers between art and audience, really push the boundaries of what art could be.
They had names like the Tattoo Show, Joe Tate's Backyard, and the Camping Show.
Yeah, really out there. And they were all about the process, about the interaction between the artists. Sometimes the final product wasn't even the point. It was about the creative energy, the experience itself.
And he often signed these collaborative works as just anonymous artists. He really didn't want the focus to be on the individual.
That's right. It was about the work, the ideas, not about ego or fame. A really radical concept in a field that can be so obsessed with individual recognition.
And the Mouche Volantes style. It evolved again in the 1980s through his collaboration with Nancy Giordano.
Yeah, they started using dots and dashes to create these really intricate optical illusions. It's amazing how he could work in such different styles, you know, always experimenting, always pushing himself to explore new ways of seeing and creating.
So taking all of this into account, all these influences, all these different phases, what would you say are the big themes, the overarching ideas that we see in Camblin's work?
Well, one that's really central is this constant interplay between art and philosophy. His images, they're like visual questions, and his philosophy is grappling with those questions but never arriving at a definitive answer. He's always exploring, questioning.
And he had this way of transforming ordinary things into these really powerful
I
symbols.
like the figure four trap, which we've mentioned a few
And
times.
it keeps coming up.
It does, and it's such a great example because it's this simple, almost primitive object, but it becomes the symbol of being trapped, of those unseen forces that shape our lives, often without us even realizing it.
So illusion, being trapped, the idea that things are always changing, that we can't hold on to anything permanently, those are big themes.
They are. He was really fascinated by the nature of reality, by how easily we can be fooled by appearances, and by the absurdity of trying to control things that are inherently out of our control.
But there's also this theme of stillness, right?
Hmm.
Which seems to be in tension with all that change and uncertainty.
Yes, that's a really important point. In one of the book reviews, there's this image of a bound form or an unshaken figure right at the edge of the unknown. It's a powerful image, and I think it speaks to Camblin's belief that even in the midst of all this chaos, there's this potential for inner peace, for stillness.
It's about finding that center.
Exactly.
And he was always connecting the personal to the bigger picture. We see that especially in Mother and Child.
That painting is so rich. It's obviously a depiction of a mother and child, but there's so much more going on there. The fragmented background, the symbolism, it all points to a larger social, historical context that's shaping their relationship, their individual paths.
The YouTube discussion really breaks it down. You've got the child in orange, the adult in green and brown, this stark geometric background. Their skin is this almost otherworldly blue-green. It gives them this universal quality.
Absolutely. It's not just about a specific mother and child. It's about motherhood, childhood, the human condition.
And they're holding hands, which is such a simple gesture, but it's so loaded with meaning. It's about connection, but also about separation. The child is wearing one white shoe. The adult has solid blue shoes. It's such a subtle detail, but it's so striking.
Yeah, it speaks to that tension between attachment and independence, between innocence and experience.
The discussion also brings up those faint numerals in the background, those architectural shapes. They're like symbols of time passing, of history, of this ongoing narrative that we're all part of.
It's like their personal story is unfolding against this vast backdrop of time and change.
They connect the painting to I Ching hexagram 53, which is about gradual progress, the passing of wisdom between generations. And they talk about the Tao Te Ching and its emphasis on balance, the balance between past and future, stillness and motion.
Camblin was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy. He wasn't just referencing it superficially. He was weaving those ideas into the fabric of his work.
So ultimately, Mother and Child is this really powerful meditation on the cycle of life, on the bonds that connect us, the burdens we carry, and the hopes we hold on to.
It's a perfect example of how he could take a seemingly simple image and imbue it with so much depth, so much meaning. It's art that stays with you long after you've seen it.
Now, in 1976, Camblin makes this pretty radical decision. He leaves his teaching job and embraces this nomadic lifestyle.
It was a big shift, but it shows how committed he was to his art. He needed that freedom, that space to create on his own terms. And his travels, they took him all over the world. Italy, France, Ireland, Mexico, the South Pacific. All those experiences fed into his work.
And he kept creating. I mean, he was prolific.
He had to be. That's how he funded his travels, how he lived. It was a constant process of creation, of observation, of translation.
But in his later years, he settled down with his wife, Nancy, first in Oregon, then Louisiana. And it sounds like he became much more reclusive.
He did. It seems like he needed that solitude, that distance from the art world to really focus on his work without distractions.
Since his passing, there have been efforts to organize posthumous exhibitions.
Which isn't surprising. I think his work is only becoming more relevant, more resonant.
And the quotes from his peers, the collectors, they all talk about his enigmatic nature, his influence, the hidden depths in his art. And Earl Staley's recollections of their friendship, their collaborations, they're really special.
Staley really understood him. He saw his generosity, his willingness to mentor, his playful spirit. And those stories about Beanie Productions, about their crazy shows, they give us a glimpse into a whole other side of Camblin. It makes him feel more human, more relatable.
So, I mean, it's clear that Bob Camblin was one of a kind. He never really fit into any one box. He was always following his own path.
He was. He was a true original, a visionary. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventions, to explore big ideas, to make us question what we see and how we see it. And I think that's what makes his work so enduring, so powerful. It's art that makes you think, art that stays with you.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the art and philosophy of Bob Camblin, it's clear that he wasn't just a painter or a draftsman. He was this really unique thinker, this weaver of ideas.
Yeah, his work is so multi-layered. It pulls from so many different sources, and it really invites us to think deeply, to engage with those big questions about life, about meaning, about reality itself.
And one of the things that keeps coming up is this idea that his art is full of like riddles, or as one review put it, riddles disguised as structures. It's not about easy answers. It's about the process of questioning, of searching.
Exactly, and in a way, his art is a form of, as another review put it, everyday enlightenment. It's about challenging those assumptions we have about the world, about ourselves, and finding a new way of seeing, a new way of being. It's about embracing those mysteries, those paradoxes, and finding beauty in the unexpected.
So, to our listener, we'll leave you with this thought. Think about which of Camblin's paradoxes or hidden meanings you connect with the most. What does that tell you about your own way of seeing the world, your own inner landscape? And we really encourage you to keep exploring his work. There's so much to discover, so much to ponder.
It's a journey worth taking.
Thanks for diving in with us.
It was a pleasure.